Good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Vélez Salas, and today we will analyze how the economic growth of a country can be explained by the banking system or the capital market. We will do this through an analysis of the Ecuadorian economy using the autoregressive model with distributed lags proposed by Nayasha and Odiambo in 2015. Through this presentation, we will present the previous contributions on this topic worldwide and the methodology used, to finally present the results and conclusions obtained in this study carried out in Ecuador for the period 2001 to 2016. The first evidence on the relationship between economic growth and the financial system were made by Schumpeter in 1991. In his theory on economic development, he expressed that there is a positive relationship between these variables. There are several studies that align with his theory, as well as others that express a minimal, null, or negative relationship. In Ecuador, we have studies such as Rojas' thesis 2009, which determines a negative influence between banks and economic growth, or the publication of Macias 2014 about financial development and determinants, analyzes both markets and concludes that Ecuador has a financial and stock market poorly developed. The first has been affected by the low score on indicators such as investor protection or openness to trade, while the second by the low use by private investors, and a large part of their issuers are the public sector and the banks. Recently, it has been widely used the ARDL model approach to examine the presence of a link between these variables. However, these studies do not consider the importance of the capital market in the analysis as the works carried out by Nayasha and Odiambo, in which they infer that this sector contributes more in each of the analyzed economies. In economies such as Brazil, South Africa, and Australia, it is observed that the predominant sector is the one that in the end has the greatest influence on economic growth, while in countries like the United Kingdom and Kenya, the analysis showed the opposite, despite the fact that intermediaries are the ones with the most participation. They even generate a negative influence in both the short and long term in growth, while the sector that concentrates the least is the one that contributes the most and in a positive way. This encourages us to expand these studies and include the capital market in the analysis, determine if it has an influence on economic growth, or if the low level of the development of the financial system in Ecuador makes them less relevant to the dynamics of the economy. In this framework, is there a relationship between financial development and economic growth in Ecuador? Who has the greatest influence on economic growth, the capital market or the banking system? Is the high banking concentration in Ecuador makes this market have greater influence on the economy? In 2015, Nayasha and Odiambo decided to incorporate the capital market and financial intermediation market into a study through an index prepared from its most representative variables to provide a better image of the behavior of each one in the economy. To carry out the analysis, it uses the ARDL model proposed by Pizarran and Shin in 1995, which will allow the dependent variable to be explained by the large values of itself and by successive lags of the explanatory variables, showing whether the impact on the dependent variable is concentrated or diluted over time. The ARDL model is also characterized by being useful when working with small samples because it allows the inclusion of variables that have a different order of integration, less than or equal to 1. The variable to be explained in this study is the economic growth of Ecuador, which will be represented by the GDP variation. This is because economic growth is usually associated with productivity and the variation rate as the main indicator in the evolution of an economy. On the other hand, the following independent variables are incorporated to determine their relationship with economic growth. The banking system through an index represented by the initials BFD and built with the variables M2, M3 and loans granted to the private sector. M2 is a good indicator for the size of this market. The higher the financial services, they are more accessible. Meanwhile, M3 shows us the progress and domestic credit to private sector, the scope of efficient resource allocation. The capital market, through an index represented by the initials MFD, formed with the variables market capitalization, total value of shares traded, and turnover rate. In the same way, the first one shows us the size of this market, while the other two reflects its liquidity. And in turn, we add to the Model 3 control variables such as investment, savings, and commercial openness. These variables are considered widely correlated with economic growth and will serve as control parameters in the study. Another point to consider in this study is the concentration of one or another market, which will allow us to conclude if high concentration implies a greater contribution to economic growth. When analyzing the data, it was observed that the banking system is the one with the highest participation, given that the variation in its size in the 16 years of analysis was 83.13%, while the capital market in the same period only increased its participation in 6.15%. In this way, agreeing with Martin 2011. In his study on bank concentration through applying the index HHI at Ecuador in the period 2005 to 2009, where it concluded that it was in an area of medium bank concentration, given that the index calculated in these years was less than 1,800. To carry out the model, the following process is carried out. The stationary is verified in the variables, the residual diagnosis is made, a cointegration test in order to obtain the long-term dynamics, and then generate the error correction model and obtain the short-term dynamics. When performing the stationarity test on the select variables, it can be concluded that, in first difference, they are all stationary with a significance level of 10%. After verifying stationarity, each scenario is simulated, which shows that the absolute value of the F statistic and the T statistic are above the upper critical value, which allows us to conclude that there is a long-term relationship between the independent variables and the dependent variable. In scenarios 1 through 4, a significance level of 1% is considered. However, for scenario 5, in the T statistic, a significance level of 2.5% is considered. Given at 1%, the test would be inconclusive, since that your statistic falls between the lower and upper critical value. With the cointerest variables, the ARDL model can be estimated and the long-term dynamics can be obtained. To subsequently generate the error correction model and obtain the short-term dynamics. Preliminarily, we observe the negative signs for the banking system index in both terms, while the capital market index shows positive influence in the short term and negative influence in the long term. The error correction term tells us how fast the variables return the equilibrium in the long term. So the coefficient obtained of less 1.181163 implies that 118.11% of any movement in imbalance is corrected within a period with a significance level of 1%. It is also observed that the adjusted regression line, it fits the data very well. So with the obtained results, we can get efficient conclusions. With a significance level of 10%, it is observed that both investment and trade openings have a positive influence on GDP in the short term, thus being the signs of their coefficients, adequate according to economic theory. However, it is evident that saving has a negative sign. Pozo, in 2016, on his article about national savings, mentions that the state had no savings in the study period. Rather, there were increases in government spending, leaving it in a fiscal deficit. When reviewing the national accounts of the Ecuadorian economy, a change in its structure was observed in 2007. Given this argument, it could be inferred that these changes were not so beneficial to the economy, as the results obtained shows that with a variation of 1 unit of the variable savings, the economy contracted 1.47 times in the short term and 1.17 times in the long term. Given these arguments, it could be inferred that these changes were not as beneficial for the economy, since the results obtained shows that when faced a variation on 1 unit of the SAV variable, the economy contracted 1.47 times in the short term and 1.17 times in the long term. If this is the case, this not only affects the SFV variable, but also the IMV variable, which in the long term shows a negative sign. This leaves a new question to investigate that allows determine why these variables have a opposite direction to economic growth, and whether or not this was due to changes made in the calculation matrix raised by the government of that time. The banking system index has no direct relationship with the growth of the Ecuadorian economy, neither short nor long term. The coefficient obtained for this variable is less 19.46 and less 2.62 respectively. This may be due to the fact that companies and people go to this sector to solve liquidity problems, since loans for the commercial sector are short-term, 2 years for working capital and 5 for fixed assets, which is not very useful if you want to make large investments in structures or assets, because it reduces the cash flow of the business and prevents it from growing. In the case of the capital market, due to the already exposed benefits of investing in it, it is accepted that it will channel resources more efficiently towards productive activities. In the results obtained, it is observed that in it, this has a direct relationship with economic growth, although only in the short term, where the growth of this market implies an economic expansion of 0.33 times. However, in the long term, at least 2.19 concentration is observed. This may be due to the low participation of this sector in the economy, only 6.16% in 2016. The results obtained in this model for the BFD variable agree with those obtained by Rojas 2009, where he analyzes the variables used to prepare the BFD index independently, concluding the existence of a negative relationship. Nayasha and Odhiambo, in their studies of economies such as Kenya and United Kingdom, conclude that the market with the highest concentration is not necessarily the one that contributes the most to economic growth. In Ecuador, we obtain similar results. The capital market contributes the most despite the fact there is moderate banking concentration. Finally, with these results we can conclude variables are related. The process determines the existence of a short and long-term relationship between the dependent variable y and the explanatory ones, a statistically significant result. Capital market is more relevant. It has a minimal positive influence in the short term on economic growth, while in the long term, due to distortions, it increases negatively, presenting a contraction in growth. Trading market has a negative influence on economic growth, rated in the short term. Finally, banking concentration is moderate and has a negative influence on economic growth. Thank you for your attention.